Fernando, 18 e 19 de junho. Este ano inventamos novas maneiras de juntar poetas de lugares diferentes em conversas e leituras. Conceição Lima,
Ian Wagner,
Ron Padgett e Samira da Cruz gravaram vídeos e áudios. Luís Filipe Castelnunes, Miguel Manso, Regina Guimarães e Rita da Borda Duarte estarão em presença na Casa Fernando Pessoa. Conheça a programação detalhada em casafernandopessoa.pt.
Good afternoon. We have here with us the poet Ron Padgett. Ron Padgett was born in Tulsa, Oklahoma in 1942. He is an American poet, essayist, fiction writer, translator, and member of the so-called New York School. Great Balls of Fire, the first collection of his poetry, was published in 1969. Since the 60s, Padgett has been a central figure in contemporary American poetry, publishing more than 20 collections. He is also a translator from French of works by Blaise Cendrars and Guillaume Apollinaire. He has received many awards over his career of more than 50 years. His last book, Big Cabin, was published in 2019. Hello, dear Ron Padgett. It's really a pleasure having you here with us.
Well, it's great to be here. Thank you, Isabel. It's nice to be with you.
Thank you. Yesterday, I was listening to a conversation that you have somewhere. I don't know exactly the name of the place. And you were repeating a word. I guess it's the word bullet. And you said bullet, bullet, but bullet, bullet. And the word... until the word lost its meaning and the sound transformed. You are talking about your beginning as a poet, I guess, and I would like you very much to tell us how that relation, your relation with poetry, start. I guess the music has something to do with that.
Yes, well, it's very hard to figure out when anything really starts. But as a child, I liked word games, and like you mentioned, I was fascinated by repeating the same word over and over and over until it lost its meaning and became a sound, a strange sound. I mean, I didn't do that all day, but I think it's a common thing that children do. But I like jokes and play on words and things like that as a child. A lot of children share this fascination. But my family was not a literary family at all. We didn't have very many books at home. Mm-hmm. Parents were not educated people. And so the only poetry I knew about came from school, where we were given a little bit of poetry, and it was mainly very boring poetry. And
such as? Can you?
Oh, well, it was mainly 19th century American poetry, which I found very boring at the time. And but when I got to be about, I would say, 15 years old, I discovered Walt Whitman on my own. And,
Leaves of Grass?
Yes, Leaves of Grass, yeah. And The Song of Myself. It was, for me, an electrifying experience. And very soon, maybe only a few months later, I discovered Allen Ginsberg's book, Howl, and was amazed by it. And I really got interested in poetry at that point, and then began to read everything, especially 20th century poetry. And so that's sort of how it started. Also, I should say, I had a very good friend who was 1 year older than me, who lived immediately across the street from me. And he and I sort of helped each other discover new poets, and we got excited together about poetry. It was very helpful to have a friend like that.
And so you left Tulsa and went to New York. How's that decision came to you?
Well, I graduated from high school, and it was time for me to go to college, and I applied to very few places, but one of them, Columbia University in New York City, accepted me, and I was very excited to go there, and very lucky also. I was excited to go there for several reasons. One, it was in New York, and I had never been to the east part of the United States, and certainly not New York, which was a legendary place, of course. And so I was excited to go to this big city. And the other reason was Columbia University was the place where my literary heroes at that time, Allen Ginsberg and Jack Kerouac, had both been students at Columbia. So I thought, oh, great! This is the place for me.
What were the main difference when you talk about Ginsberg or Kerouac? Those writers made in American literature at that time. It was a kind of revolution, wasn't it?
Well, certainly for me it was. I had never read anything like On the Road or The Subterraneans, and although Ginsberg's poem Howl was very similar to Walt Whitman's in some ways, it was very different in one very important way for me. Allen Ginsberg was actually alive. He was the first writer that I read that was actually alive, I think. And it was very exciting to think that right now, Allen Ginsberg is alive. And I'm going to New York, and I will be within, 5 minutes from him, And I began a correspondence with Allen Ginsberg when I was I was 17 years old. And
Tell us.
Yeah, he was very nice and wrote me back wonderful letters and postcards. And when he learned I was coming to New York, he said, well, call me, come and see me. And so I did. And
you did.
It was very simple. I just called him and got on the subway, the Metropolitan, and went down, and there was Allen Ginsberg. It was wonderful, and he was very nice.
What was your reaction? You can spoke. You could. You have some words came. Any words came to you?
Yes. Well, I was very nervous, of course, because I idolized him, and also I knew he was gay, and I was not gay, so I was a little nervous there. But
okay.
No, he was very kind to me, and he did he asked me a lot of questions. Like he said, have you read Jean Genet, for example? And or have you read the Tibetan Book of the Dead? And he began to give me books to take with me to read, and he asked me about my parents and how I grew up, and so he did most of the talking. But he was very very nice.
But we are here to talk about you, and now you are almost a legend for the young poets. Also, I'm remembering that when your collected poems came out in 2013, the poet Anne Waldman wrote something like this: Ron Padgett's poems are essential, and Ron Padgett is a genius. His poetry is a masterful of his panoramic humanity and mind-stopping verbal wit, its breathtaking power and beauty. I know this is a difficult compliment to counter. It's been 8 years since there have been more books, and I'd like you to know from these words, how do you look at your poetic work as a whole till now?
Oh, I think Anne Waldman was absolutely right. I should tell you that Anne Waldman is an old friend of mine, and so her compliment is, I think, partly created by our friendship, but she was very nice of her to write those things. But as far as myself, in my own opinion, sometimes I look back at poetry I've written, 50, 60 years ago, and I'm surprised because I still like it. And sometimes I look back at it and I don't like it. It depends on how I feel that day. But mainly I just don't look back that much unless I'm forced to.
Yes.
And because I'm not, what I've written, I've written. It's finished. It's really not mine anymore. And the things I wrote when I was, say, 20 years old, I'm really a different person now. And so I don't feel ownership of that work. I'm only interested in what I'm writing now or what I think I might write. So I think it's very distracting to try to look at one's own work, a big body of work, and say, I did well, I did terrible. It's kind of a waste of time, really. There are better things to do than think about oneself.
Okay. Your poems, I guess I was reading some in Portuguese and in English those days, and they contain pathos, they contain joy, they contain sadness, and they contain the banal and the universal, almost always built from the most prosaic everyday life, with details that often only appear in the shadows of human existence. What is that holds your attention as a poet? These kind of shadows that we don't see obviously. They are important to you.
That's very profound what you said. I never thought about those shadows very much. I'm mainly interested in words and how words take us to places that we have never understood or been to before. And for me, a poem is an adventure. It's not a statement of some kind of wisdom or knowledge that you've acquired in your life. It's not even necessarily a way of expressing your joy or your sadness. It's really, I start with words, and they lead to those things sometimes, and sometimes they lead in ways that are interesting to follow. Sometimes they don't, and those are what are called bad poems. But I don't think of myself as a very profound person. I'm an intelligent person, but I'm not particularly profound. And I think about small things a lot. For example, where's my other key to the car? Where did I put that? And I know it's here somewhere in the house. And then sometimes just the experience of thinking about the word key might lead me to write some poem about looking for the keys. I don't know.
Yes.
Just saying that I start with words. I don't start, very rarely do I start with ideas.
Or images.
Well, sometimes, in the 1970s, 60s, and 70s, sometimes a very strange image would occur to me. And I would, such as a duck that's flying in the sky and suddenly explodes. Had this image appear to me once, and that started me writing, But normally, no. Normally I start with words. That's to say, in poetry. Prose is a different thing.
That take me to another thing that a critic speak of you as the Peter Pan of contemporary American poetry. It's because of that fantasy that you put in many of your poems. How do you see yourself in that role of a fantasist?
We have a food product in this country, maybe you have it too now, called peanut butter.
Yes, yes.
And there's a very famous brand or mark of peanut butter here called Peter Pan peanut butter. So sometimes I feel like Peter Pan peanut butter, but not like Peter Pan himself.
But the role of fantasy and imagination, you talked about the adventure. You like very much of the idea of adventure in your poems, in your work. The role of imagination that we sometimes connect more with fiction than with poetry is very important to you, isn't it?
When I suppose so. Yeah. I mean, it's throughout a lot of my poems. Yeah. I don't think I'm so unusual in that regard. I mean, everybody has an imagination. It's just that not so many people decide to get access to it. But everybody inside, it's like everybody has a dream life, an unconscious life, and it's possible to connect yourself with that part of yourself if you want to. So I don't think there's anything so extraordinary about my using the imagination in poetry at all. Also, the distinction between prose and poetry is sometimes overemphasized, I think.
You write both, so you can tell us a little bit of what they have in common and in what way they are different.
Well, that's a big question.
It is.
I would have to define what is poetry and then what is prose, and that takes all day to try to do. But there's something in between them called prose poetry as well, of course. Yes. And as we all know now. So there's extremely imaginative poetry on the one hand, and on the other hand, there's a kind of expository, very dry writing in prose, such as if you're writing a critical essay or you're writing a biography or a piece of nonfiction. Yes, that's not, to me, very close to writing poetry. But except they both, they're all these forms, prose poetry and prose poetry, all use words. And as a writer, I think it's a good idea to try to be very aware of the words you're using and how you're using them. But not in the initial drafts. When I first write a poem, I'm not that careful. But I have to go back and work hard to make the poem be as good as it can possibly be. That's not a very good answer to your question, I'm afraid, but it's about all my poor brain can handle at this moment.
Yeah, but tell me about that process, because you said that a poem can mainly start with a word. It may be a word key, but that work after that first word. Tell me about all that work that it takes to you.
Well, sometimes a poem will start with a word or a phrase, or it's just something that happened. For instance, there's a poem of mine that I was sitting at my desk, and suddenly I noticed my heartbeat became very strange. It went ka-ga-thump, and it was kind of scary. And so I sat there for a minute and thought, am I really going to write a poem now? I mean, I just got scared by my heartbeat. So I wrote down, a second ago, my heart thump went. And then it went, the poem just went on from there. I just followed the stream of my own mind, let's say.
And that your body, the stream of your body also.
Yes, unfortunately, yes. But I'm saying it didn't. So that poem didn't really start with a word. It started with a thump.
Yes. Much of your poetry is I guess very close to a narrative, to storytelling. Sometimes you also create characters. Can you understand why that happened? You choose to do that. It was intuitive. It was an instinct. How's that?
You mean to create characters, or
that kind of storytelling? Sometimes with characters also. Yes.
Yeah. Well. there's a long history, of course, of narrative poetry. I mean, so there's nothing new about that. And everybody likes stories anyway. I mean, that's not extraordinary. But as far as creating characters, that interests me. Sometimes I don't create characters so much as use characters that already exist.
Mm-hmm.
There was a period when I wrote a number of poems that had characters from films and from children's cartoons and from children's comic books, and it was fun to bring those characters into my poem. I liked having them in the poem, just like children like having those characters in their fantasies or in their minds. And then there are other characters in poems of mine who actually are real people. My parents, my wife, my son, my grandchildren, friends of mine who appear in poems of mine also. Now, and to some degree, they're characters. I mean, they're the real people, but of course, they're not the real people. They're names in poems. And so they become a little different there. I don't know, I'm fascinated. I like having it's a poem with characters in it is less lonely, I think.
Mm-hmm.
It's comforting to me to have them in there.
It's took us to another trace of your work, that is autobiography. You have lots of autobiography in your poems, and my question is obvious: is why do you do that? It's natural.
I guess I'm obsessed with myself. If you look at my the big book of mine called Collected Poems,
yes,
you go to the index of first lines in the back of the book. A lot of first lines begin with I. It's kind of embarrassing, actually, but sometimes, though, I should add, when there's a character in a poem of mine called I. It's not me. It's not the author. I've created a persona, either intentionally or not. And this makes one think of Fernando Pessoa. I mean,
yes.
And he was not the only one to create characters, but there have been others as well. But I just want to emphasize that when I say I in a poem, it's not always me, not always.
You mentioned your work with movies, and I'm so sorry, but I know that you have mentioned this many times. But I have to ask you about your collaboration with the film Patterson of Jim Jarmusch. What was like to write poems there for a character, putting yourself in the shoes of a fictional poet?
Yeah, that's a good example, though. First of all, let me say that the Jim Jarmusch, who created that film, is an old friend of mine, and he invited me to. He called me and asked to use some poems of mine in the film, and he told me about the film, and I said, "Wonderful, please go ahead." And then he said, "Well, you could write some more poems for the film if you like." And I said, "Oh, no. It's too scary. I can't do that. It's And he said,
what do you think was scary to do that?
Too much pressure. It's called performance anxiety. It's why the John Lennon, he threw up. He vomited before he went on the stage every time. I felt like it was too nervous for me. Anyway, Jim sent me the script and I read it and I thought, well, no, I can't write any poems for this. And then I immediately wrote a poem for it. And I found it very easy. I wrote 4 poems 3 poems one day and one day the next. And Jim, he used 3 of them. So it was actually very easy, it turned out. I was very surprised. But it was fun to try to project myself into the character in that film. I had never done that. But let me say one more thing while I can. The film was premiered at the Estoril Lisbon Film Festival. I think it was 2016, and so Jim was invited, and because of that, I was invited also, and I came, and there was a wonderful guy there with the film festival named Antonio Costa, who was just wonderful, very smart, very nice.
I know.
And, oh yes, I think you're a friend of his. Yeah. Anyway, Antonio scheduled a poetry reading for me, and the person who read my poems in Portuguese was a Portuguese poet named Marta Chaves.
Yes.
And did a wonderful reading, and she's a really, really nice person. And she told her friend, an editor named Vasco David, about my poetry, and he looked at it and he wanted to publish a book, and he did publish a book, a beautiful edition. What's the company is called? Assidio and Alvim. Yeah, beautiful, big book, translated wonderfully by a Portuguese woman, Rosalina Marshall. Mm-hmm. And I'm so happy with this book, so pleased.
Can you understand Portuguese or
a little bit? Because I speak some Italian, I speak French, I know some Spanish, and so I can. My Portuguese is terrible, but I can look, and I have a pretty good idea. And so, and the book is en face. It's bilingual, and or I can a little bit like that, So anyway, it was a very great, wonderful experience that came out of it. Just because Jim Jarmusch called me on the telephone one day, and now I have this wonderful book in Portuguese.
And you wrote that poems very quickly. How did that work? It was also a word, an idea. What came? You start a poem thinking of what when you wrote the poem for that film, the first one, for instance.
I was thinking. Actually, I had a fantasy of what the film would look like at a certain moment in the film. The script was very, very simple, very, very bare. It was not many details at all. But I knew this man was a bus driver of a city bus in this town, Paterson, New Jersey. And I'd been to Paterson many years ago. Mm-hmm. I had some idea of what it looked like, but I suddenly had a fantasy of driving this bus down the streets of Paterson, New Jersey, and then writing the poem was very easy after that.
Another thing that I would like to ask you is about New York School. Your name is always associated with this movement. I don't know, this school, New York School. Today, years after the beginning of that movement, how do you look at it, and how do you see yourself in it?
Well, first you're assuming that there is such a thing.
Yeah, I'm just quoting.
I know, but you have to take responsibility for that quote too.
I do.
No, the name, the New York School of Poetry, or the New York School of Poets, was created by a man who operated an art gallery in New York, and he published some wonderful poets there, little books from his art gallery, and he needed a way to market his books, so he made up this name. They're the New York School of Poets, like the École de Paris painters, or the New York School of Painters. He created this. It's kind of a fiction. The poets who are put into this group by critics are John Ashbery, Kenneth Coe, James Schuyler, and Frank O'Hara, and others. Mm-hmm. And then some younger poets, such as myself. And I don't pay any attention to that category. It's something that critics use, book reviewers use. I have no use for it. It doesn't help me understand anything. It doesn't help me write poetry. So to me, if people want to call me a New York School poet, that's fine. just to me, it's almost meaningless.
Mhm.
I would
But
be.
how?
Go ahead.
No, no, please, you go on, complete your idea.
Yeah, I was going to add that uh, I would be happier to be called part of the Tulsa School of Poets because it's a joke name that John Ashbery gave to me and some friends of mine who came from New York who became poets and writers. Ted Berrigan, Joe Brainerd, who's also was an artist and a writer, and Dick Gallup. The four of us came to New York about the same time, and we were all friends from Tulsa. And so
Yes.
we formed a little group, our own little group. So when John Ashbery made a joke and called us the Tulsa School of Poets, we thought that was great. We liked that one.
Yeah, and you arrived in New York at 18, I guess. You were 18.
Yeah.
A city in the 60s, New York City in the 60s was something very different from Tulsa. How was the? Tell me a little bit. We know New York from the 60s, from the movies, the music, the literature, but we not know almost nothing about Tulsa in the 60s. Can you tell us the difference? What was the great difference between living in Tulsa and living in New York in that period?
Oh, for me, it was a huge difference. Tulsa was not a small town. It was a fairly large city. I think around 180,000 people.
Mm-hmm.
It was a fairly quiet place. We had good public schools. And
You studied there.
I'm sorry?
You studied there in public schools in Tulsa.
Yes, yeah. Just like other children, there were very few private schools. But it was a city that I was eager to leave for a number of reasons. The cultural atmosphere, I felt very restricted, and also it was a racially segregated city, and I found that very uncomfortable and disagreeable. And I just wanted to get out and see the world, basically. And in New York City, you can see a lot of the world in New York City because it's there are all people from all over the world living there. And but the big thing for me was the energy level.
Yes.
New York was just pulsing with energy, and everybody was going fast, and they were doing this, and they were accomplishing this, and having exhibitions and writing books. And there were so many movie theaters. You could see great old classic movies, and you could see European movies, and there were all these possibilities that were so exciting to me. And then at school was really an interesting challenge also, because it's a very good school. I had some wonderful teachers there, particularly Kenneth Koch, the poet.
Yes.
Who was just an incredible professor. So also, New York was also a little bit scary for a boy like me. It was intimidating. It was big and kind of rough, and people weren't very polite sometimes, and I wasn't used to it. It took me a while to get used to living there. But anyway, that's...
But you still live there. Now you are in Vermont, but you still live in New York, I guess.
Yes, I live in New York, but I spent a lot of time in the rural Vermont in the Northeast, almost in Canada. And,
yes.
Very beautiful here and very quiet.
They are telling me that our time is just finishing, but I have a last question to you. It is very common these days in times like this of crisis, like this one that we are experiencing, to ask what can poetry and what can poets do? I would like to hear you about this. What is the power of poetry in moments like this one?
It's very hard for me to know the answer to that question. Sometimes I think that poetry makes absolutely no difference whatsoever. And sometimes I feel that good poetry at the right time with the right readers really gives people a sense that life is valuable, it's worthwhile, and that it makes people feel happy and optimistic. And I'm hoping that anything I write might do that, but I can't promise it. I can't pretend that my poetry, for example, will make any difference at all. I really don't know. I just don't know. And in the United States, I think right now, I get the feeling that we're going through a very interesting period. And unfortunately, I will not live long enough to find out how it comes out. But this country is going to change for the better or for the worse. It's not going to remain the same.
Are
And
you?
poetry will have a role to play in that, I'm sure.
Ron, thank you so much for this conversation, for your time. It was a pleasure. And I hope to see you soon in Lisbon, maybe.
That would be nice, Isabel. Thanks for talking to me. I appreciate it. And thank you to everyone else there at the Casa Fernando Pessoa. It's wonderful.
Obrigada.
Hey, you too.